The Watsons by Jane Austen, Part 11. He was rewarded by a gracious answer, a more liberal full view of her face than she had yet bestowed. Unused to exerting himself and happy in contemplating her, he then sat in silence for some minutes longer while Tom Musgrave was chattering to Elizabeth, till they were interrupted by Nanny's approach, who, half opening the door and putting in her head, said, "Please, ma'am, master wants to know why he bent to have his dinner." The gentleman, who had hitherto disregarded every symptom, however positive, of the nearness of that meal, now jumped up with apologies, while Elizabeth briskly called after Nanny to tell Betty to take up the fowls. "I am sorry it happened so," she added, turning good-humouredly towards Musgrave, "but you know what early hours we keep." Tom had nothing to say for himself. He knew it very well, and such honest simplicity, such shameless truth rather bewildered him. Lord Osborne's parting compliments took some time, his inclination for speech seeming to increase with the shortness of the term for indulgence. He recommended exercise in defiance of dirt, spoke again in praise of half-boots, begged that his sister might be allowed to send Emma the name of her shoemaker, and concluded with saying, "My hounds will be hunting this country next week. I believe they will throw off at Stanton Wood on Wednesday at 9 o'clock. I mention this in hopes of your being drawn out to see what's going on. If the morning's tolerable, pray do us the honour of giving us your good wishes in person." The sisters, the reader currently does not agree with hunting. I am a reader, this is not part of Jane Austen's writing, but I just wish to say I love Jane Austen, but I do not agree with hunting in any form, especially for sport. I shall continue. The sisters looked on each. I'm not sure if Jane Austen did either, but she knew of the ways of the time. I'll continue. The sisters looked on each other with astonishment when their visitors had withdrawn. "Here's an unaccountable honour," cried Elizabeth at last. "Who would have thought of Lord Osborne's coming to Stanton? He is very handsome, but Tom Musgrave looks all to nothing. The smartest and most fashionable man of the two. I am glad he did not say anything to me. I would not have had to talk so to such a great man for the world. Tom was very agreeable, was he not? But did you hear him ask where Miss Penelope and Miss Margaret were when he first came in? He put me out of patience. I am glad Nanny had not laid the cloth, however. It would have looked so awkward. Just the tray did not signify." To say that Emma was not flattered by Lord Osborne's visit would be to assert a very unlikely thing and describe a very odd young lady, but the gratification was by no means unalloyed. His coming was a sort of notice which might please her vanity, but did not suit her pride, and she would rather have known that he wished the visit without presuming to make it than have seen him at Stanton. Among other unsatisfactory feelings, it once occurred to her to wonder why Mr. Howard had not taken the same privilege of coming and accompanied his lordship, but she was willing to suppose that he had either known nothing about it or had declined any share in a measure which carried quite as much impertinence in its form as good breeding. Mr. Watson was very far from being delighted when he heard what had passed. A little peevish under immediate pain and ill-disposed to be pleased, he only replied, "Phoo, phoo! What occasion could there be for Lord Osborne's coming? I have lived here 14 years without being noticed by any of the family. It is some foolery of that idle fellow Tom Musgrave. I cannot return the visit. I would not if I could." And when Tom Musgrave was met with again, he was commissioned with a message of excuse to Osborne Castle, on the too sufficient plea of Mr. Watson's infirm state of health. A week or 10 days rolled quietly away after this visit before any new bustle arose to interrupt, even for half a day, the tranquil and affectionate intercourse of the two sisters, whose mutual regard was increasing with the intimate knowledge of each other which such intercourse produced. The first circumstance to break in on this serenity was the receipt of a letter from Croydon to announce the speedy return of Margaret, and a visit or 2 or 3 days from Mr. and Mrs. Robert Watson, who undertook to bring her home and wished to see their sister Emma. It was an expectation to fill the thoughts of the sisters at Stanton, and to busy the hours of one of them at least, for as Jane had been a woman of fortune, the preparations for her entertainment were considerable, and as Elizabeth had at all times more goodwill than method in her guidance of the house, she could make no change without a bustle. An absence of 14 years had made all her brothers and sisters strangers to Emma, but in her expectation of Margaret there was more than the awkwardness of such an alienation. She had heard things which made her dread her return, and the day which brought the party to Stanton seemed to her the probable conclusion of almost all that had been comfortable in the house. Robert Watson was an attorney at Croydon, in a good way of business, very well satisfied with himself for the same, and for having married the only daughter of the attorney to whom he had been the clerk, with a fortune of £6,000. Mrs. Robert was not less pleased with herself for having had that £6,000, and for being now in possession of a very smart house in Croydon, where she gave genteel parties and wore fine clothes. In her person there was nothing remarkable. Her manners were pert and conceited. Margaret was not without beauty. She had a slight, pretty figure, and rather wanted countenance than good features, but the sharp and anxious expression of her face made her beauty in general little felt. On meeting her long-absent sister, as on every occasion of show, her manner was all affection, and her voice all gentleness, continual smiles and a very slow articulation being her constant resort when determined on pleasing. End of Part 11.